Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Kvetching with Adam and Jarrod, a continuously low-budget Jewish production. We are slowly working our way up to a medium-quality Jewish production as soon as the powers that be see fit, which are really in YouTube's hands at this point. And this is episode 8 of our podcast. We are really on a roll here. We only started in September, and that's what we're trying to do here. We are living in a Jewish emergency, if you will, and we need to get the word out on the problems. So I am Jarrod. I teach Jewish history at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington.
And I'm Adam Fuller. I teach political science and Jewish studies at Youngstown State University.
And our topic for tonight, we have no guests for this evening, but our topic tonight, and we might consider this another emergency broadcast because the powers that be, in this case, the discipline of sociology, has decided to issue a statement, which seems to be what many academics do best. And they write statement after statement.
Even though they're not experts on this issue whatsoever and know absolutely nothing on the topic, we have more than 2,000. You remember what the tally is now?
I will tell you in 1 second. I'm pulling up the screen. I last refreshed it an hour ago. The tally is 1920. Perhaps they've hit the 2,000 mark by this point.
Almost 2,000 sociologists who have never studied the topic whatsoever are weighing in, and they are completely vilifying the Jewish state here in this war that is currently taking place. And in their statement, there's no mention of Hamas.
They do mention Hamas at one point. I actually highlighted it. Yeah,
well,
we're going to go through the statements.
I know, but I
line
want
by
to
line.
say that up front, that there's nothing here that impugns any of the atrocities committed.
Oh, yeah, that you're right about. Yes. Yeah, they mention Hamas, but they don't mention them being guilty of having perpetrated anything.
Yeah.
And that's explicable, as we shall see, by their opening statement, their very opening sentence. Let me just preface this for people who don't know this. I'm a historian, and most historians are snobs when it comes to their discipline, because the bottom line is people in other disciplines don't really know history. They don't understand historical context. They don't understand cultural context either. And a lot of them just build models and, drop them into different parts of the world. Political science does that to a certain extent, but because of my good colleague over here, I'm not going to impugn political science as a discipline, though I'm sure he has things to say about them as well. And I will also add that, the best courses I took when I was being trained in Russian history as an undergraduate were taught by an absolutely incredible political scientist, right? It really, I learned more with that guy than I've learned with virtually any historian that I have taken courses with. So there are good political scientists. There's no question about that. Are there good sociologists? Well, I can think of one, David Hirsch, over in Britain, who wrote a fantastic book on anti-Zionism on the left in British politics. Really terrific book that, were it not only about Britain, would have gotten far more circulation than it did had he covered the United States as well, because the British Jewish community is relatively small. And he also founded recently a center for the study of anti-Semitism in Britain. And he's faced a backlash from the powers that be in the university system and even politicians. But he does great work.
I'm not familiar with any sociologist today who I think does great work. But then again, I don't follow sociology all that closely. But there's a tradition of very good sociology with Max Weber, if you go back that far, and Robert Nisbet. And of course, I'm a very big fan of Nathan Glazer, who was a major subject of one of the books that I wrote. But in terms of the field of sociology within the last few decades, I find that it is very problematic in that it is inherently leftist. And the problem with it is, in fact, encapsulated in the first line, the first sentence.
Yes, which we'll open up in 1 second. But let me just add that in terms of your leftist comment, they're driven by Marxism, right? Marx is really, at the epicenter of their discipline. In many ways, he was the first sociologist. I think they consider him their founding father. I think political science did to a certain extent as well. They bear the influence of Marx, but not in the same narrow manner that sociology.
Political science began in the early 20th century. I think that the same is is true of sociology, but it is true that there were social scientists in the 19th century who were mostly economists, but they were thinking about political economy and the role that economics has in society. And at that period of time, there was a fairly substantial left-leaning influence to some of it, but not all of it. Like I said, there were early social thinkers, social scientists who were not left-wing. It wasn't until very recently that social science became hijacked by the left.
Yeah, and a lot of disciplines have gone downhill, in part, not entirely, but in part because of the activism that has overtaken the disciplines. And
Economics is the obvious one that has not been completely hijacked by the left. There's still, free market economists, and political science doesn't suffer from the same problem nearly as much as other fields like sociology does. But you're right that social science in general kind of does have this problem.
Sociologists are supposed to be data driven, but you could, if you start off with a flawed premise and then make your data fit your premise, then your data is of very limited value. So I'm going to pull up the statement here. I'm going to turn on screen share, and I've gotten better at doing this.
So this is another episode where you don't have to look at me or Jarrod, except in the little box.
Yeah, we'll be there in the little boxes, and I am sharing screen 1. Here we go, except there's no statements. Here it is. Okay. Everyone got a quick glance of my computer desktop, and that's okay. I've got nothing to hide. All right. Sociologists in solidarity with Gaza and the Palestinian people. Now, Adam had an issue with the opening sentence, as do I. So I will read the sentence, and then Adam will address the problem. Sociology as a discipline is rooted in a recognition of relationships of power and inequality.
The problem is that sociology as a discipline is about the study of society. This sentence is stating what sociology or what sociologists are supposed to think about society, right? That there's a relationship between power and inequality that explains social problems, explains everything about society. So right now you have a framework in which sociology is to be studied that becomes the definition of the discipline itself. Not all sociologists necessarily agree with this opening statement, that sociology is rooted in the recognition of relationships of power and equality.
Yeah, I mean, this is fundamentally Marxist in many respects, and Marxist-Leninist if implemented in a homogenous, monolithic manner. The opening sentence of the Communist Manifesto, all history moves forward by the class struggle. I mean, once you say that, you are limiting to yourself to the ways you can actually analyze.
I don't think it's necessary. It's not necessarily Marxist. Marxism is one of the ways in which this could be looked at, but one could say the same that it's Rawlsian.
Well, I'm using Marx as an analogy here, as another determinative and teleological
theoretical foundations, but it still ultimately culminates in the same thing, that society is all about recognizing that you always have the oppressed and you have an oppressor.
Yeah.
Some of the things that we talked about with David Bernstein.
Yeah. Now, to be sure, it's possible that most societies do have an oppressor and the oppressed, but that doesn't mean those are the keys to understanding a given society at any given moment. It's just one of many variables that you need to take into account. But they seem to be saying otherwise here. Mm-hmm. All right. So once you set that as the overall premise of everything that follows, then everything that follows is necessarily going to be flawed, especially if you're talking about a part of the world where you might not have expertise in. And I can attest to you that some of the names on this are not experts on the Middle East. I've noticed a few Russian scholars who signed this thing. Now, I have a problem with the next clause.
Can I just say one more thing about this first sentence? So are these sociologists saying that, let's say you have a perfect society, a perfectly equal society, so they were somehow able to create that, whether it's a big society or a small society. Is sociology now irrelevant in that society? Like, is there any need left?
I guess so. To put it in Leninist terms, it would be the withering away of a discipline, right? I mean, what's the point?
Right.
You don't need a state under perfect Marxist society, and you don't need sociology as a discipline if there's absolute equality. It's almost worth fighting for absolute equality just to get sociology to disappear. Yeah, maybe that should be something we should work on. Let's improve society. Let's create an anti-racist utopia so sociology will cease to exist. Now,
Well,
the next part.
But okay, yeah.
Do you have more to say on this one?
No.
Now, the next part, I just highlighted the opening clause because I found it rather curious verbiage. As sociologists and human beings, what does that mean as human beings, as opposed to what? Simians, apes, monkeys, giraffes? Why would they throw that into
Well, I think they're just trying to say, as sociologists that have hearts.
But having a heart should be utterly irrelevant if all you're looking at is power and inequality. They're reducing that to a scientific premise. I mean,
well, they want to go on record that they're compassionate people.
Okay, all right. They're not very bright human beings, but I guess I'll accept the fact that they're human beings. We unreservedly condemn the latest violence against the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank at the hands of the Israeli regime. Okay, so no mention of Hamas committing any violence in the opening part, which is important, because again, that frames it. I also want to underscore the use of the word regime here. Regime is a term that Americans tend not to use for democratic governments. It's more common in Europe for scholars to use the word regime, but in the United States, you don't say government. Nobody really talks about the American regime, right? Am I correct about that, Mr. Political Scientist?
Yeah, we do when we're trying to understand the principles of our government. I see it come up now and then, but in common parlance, no.
But is regime synonymous with government, or does it have wider implications?
There's synonymous terms. Like that's what Aristotle meant by the term regime.
Okay, so it's
government.
They're not saying every instance of every Israeli government from 1948 forward by using the word regime.
I don't. I think they just mean government.
Okay, all right.
Say regime.
I've always felt that regime sort of has a negative connotation that government doesn't necessarily have, much as ruled versus governed does. There was a very famous book about the Soviet Union during the Cold War that was called How Russia is Ruled. And after the author, Myril Feinsod, who was a political scientist, died, one of his students, who was more sympathetic to the USSR, republished the book and massaged it a bit and wrote his own intro, and he titled it How the Soviet Union is Governed. And that title alone gave the Marxist-Leninist project more legitimacy than it did under the original title. But I won't quibble over words like that. All right, let's go on. Over the past 7 days, the government of Israel has undertaken, in its own words, a complete siege of Gaza, the second most densely populated place on the planet, home to 2.1 million residents, of which 1.7 million are refugees, while claiming its actions are justifiable response to recent Hamas violence. Okay, so Hamas is mentioned here, all right, in a very, very whitewashing sort of manner.
Recent Hamas violence. Well, I mean, that could just be, like somebody did a drive-by shooting and skim somebody's cheek or something. Like what is that?
It's everything that Hamas has done since the end of the Second Intifada and 2 weeks ago.
Well, that's not how they're putting it. Like they're diminishing what has actually atrocities that actually occurred.
Yeah, I mean that's what I mean. They're discussing it for the regular quotidian actions of Hamas whenever they encounter Israelis, not the the big ones like the Second Intifada and October 7th. While claiming its actions are a justifiable response to recent Hamas violence against Israeli citizens, it has targeted the civilian population of Gaza. That's a phrase I want to come back to later based on something they write further down. While exhibiting little regard for the loss of human life, using racist and dehumanizing language, yada, yada, yada. We don't have to read every single word here. Any issues with this paragraph?
Well, I have a lot of issues with this paragraph. First of all, the recent Hamas violence, right? We've kind of already explored that against Israeli civilians. doesn't really get into the level of brutality that was perpetuated on Israel, the number of people that were killed. It doesn't mention anything about over 200 hostages that have been taken and are right at this very moment being tortured by Hamas. No mention of that. And then it goes on to say that it has targeted the civilian population of Gaza. There's no evidence at all that Israel is targeting the civilian population. What the evidence does show is that there have been civilians that have been hit and have been killed by the Israeli airstrikes. I'll tell you right now that that in Gaza there are a little bit more than 2 million people. If and how many people have died? About let's say like 5,000 Gazans have.
That was the last count I heard. Yeah,
about 5,000. If 5,000 out of 2 million civilian Gazans have been killed, I'm not going to say that that's not sad. And of course, definitely is. But what I will say is that if their intention is to target civilians, they're not doing a very good job, because that is a very small fraction of the total population in Gaza. So if they were actually targeting civilians, then a lot more than 5,000 civilians would be killed. In fact, I think it's a testament to the kind of care that the IDF is taking not to hit civilians, that it's only 5,000 out of 2 million people that have been killed. And it's especially true given the fact that the Hamas doesn't make it easy for Israel to avoid civilian targets, because they use civilians as human shields. So, given how difficult it is for the IDF, I'm surprised that it's only 5,000.
Now, I want to just go back for a second here on this sentence, because the problem is even far worse than the way you put it. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that yeah, Israel has killed civilians. Let's just assume for a second maybe they did some of it deliberately, which I'm not conceding, but let's just assume that for a second. If you read the totality of the sentence up until the word Gaza, while claiming its actions are a justifiable response to recent Hamas violence against Israeli civilians, it has targeted the civilian Palestinian population of Gaza. So somehow the crime here is only when Gazan civilians are targeted, but it's not as much of a crime when Hamas targets civilians. Otherwise, that would be half the focus.
Yeah, there's no mention of that at all.
Well, I know that, but here they do admit that Hamas targeted civilians, but that's somehow not germane to everything that follows. And that, I would argue, goes back to this opening sentence right here, right? It's relationships of power and inequality. Civilians are a legitimate target.
They're going to kind of imply later on in the statement that all of this is the fault of Israel to begin with. That the Hamas are just resisting Israeli occupation of Gaza, which actually there's no occupation. It's a blockade, but not the same thing as occupation. But one way or another, though, they're going to claim that this is Israel's fault, and that if Israel withdraws from Gaza, then everything is going to be fine, right? Yeah. That all this is just a response.
Power and inequality will disappear in Gaza, and Hamas will cease to exist, because every Palestinian will have an olive tree in his backyard and life will be wonderful. But again, it goes back to this opening phrase here: relationships of power and inequality. Once you set that as a standard, then Hamas violence against Israeli civilians has legitimacy that targeting Palestinian civilians doesn't have.
Why? Because they're the less powerful?
Exactly. Yeah, right. And that's the point here. I mean, when Hamas killed, I mean, that's the key thing here. They're actually admitting that Hamas targeted Israeli civilians without saying that that's wrong. And then they go on to berate and vilify Israel for targeting civilians. So there
is. What about the power that Hamas has over the Gazan population?
Well, I could think about 15 reasons how they could justify that away. But again, their opening sentence makes all other reasons superfluous here, right? It's all about power.
But I mean, if your sociology is about recognition of relationships of power and inequality, I mean, surely they understand that there's different layers of inequality and different layers of power. Even if you're going to presuppose that the whole thing is the fault of Israel having unequal power over Gaza, clearly you have inequalities within oppressed classes of people too, right? So what about Hamas as the power over innocent civilians in Gaza? Where's the uproar about that? Where's the uproar about what Hamas has gotten its own civilian population into?
Yeah, well, that's not how they
Small-
think, right? They
No.
think in their boxes, and their boxes in this case are vertically, or vertically stratified. And you've got the powerful on the top and the powerless on the bottom.
And there's nothing in between.
And the powerless are a collective known as Palestinians, including Hamas, as logical response to Palestinian oppression. In fact, they're sort of saying that Hamas reflects the will of the Palestinian people. So if you read this very closely, they are, in fact, one can argue that they are accidentally impugning the entire Palestinian population for the actions of Hamas. Yeah, so this is very, if they were actually to sit down and think about the logic of their statement, they would realize that they're saying some things that are actually not working in their favor. But alas, it's sociology. All right, the next paragraph, we don't have to read.
Let's talk about the comment that using racist and dehumanizing language, Israel's defense minister Yoav Gallant remarked, "We are fighting human animals and we act accordingly." They're talking about Hamas. They're not, well, they see Gallant was talking about Hamas, not the Palestinian civilians.
Yeah, no, it's a major problem, and they take quotes out of context and they use them to fit the structure of their argument. I mean, that's what they're doing, right? Again, it's all in that opening sentence right there. So deeply problematic, of course, in every respect. And what about the racist and dehumanizing language that Hamas has been using since its founding in 1988?
Have they read the covenant, the 88 covenant? I mean, it's deeply racist and dehumanizing.
Yeah. And let me underscore that Hamas's discourse is not about Israel, it's about Jews. They make it abundantly clear that Jews are a global threat, right? There's no denying that. All right, next paragraph. We don't have to read every word here. Is there anything you want to say about this paragraph?
Well, it's true that Israel has dropped over 6,000 bombs. Okay, hit the Rafah crossing on the border to Egypt several times. Now, I have heard that claim mentioned in other contexts, but I have not actually found any corroborating evidence of it. There was an explosion that hit the crossing, but apparently only once. Now, if you go to Al Jazeera, they do say that there were 3 explosions, but there's no corroborating evidence of that in any other media that I've been able to find. But there was there is info about one of the explosions that Israel is saying was an accident.
Right, and accidents, of course, happen during wartime. I mean, there's inevitable.
Yeah. And then this says targeted hospitals and ambulances. Well, I mean, if they're referring to the hospital that was hit, which we now know was misfire from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, all right, well, that wasn't Israel. If you're talking about other instances.
Was it the Al Ali Arab Hospital that kills 500? Is that the one they're referring to?
I don't know if that's what they're referring to.
Well, no, I clicked on the link. When you click on the hospitals link, that's where you get to. Israel raids air raid on Al Ali Arab Hospital, kills 500. Is that the one where it was unclear?
I believe so, yeah.
So they're lying. The statement is an outright lie.
No, they're not accepting that it wasn't Israel. I mean, there's still doubters out there.
Yeah, whack jobs on social media. You're not expecting this from a fucking discipline. I mean, come on.
Yeah, and clearly, look, so if there's targeting of hospitals, which could be happening, I'm not necessarily saying that that's not true, but Israel is not targeting these hospitals to kill anyone in it that's sick or any of the medical staff. They're targeting hospitals because Hamas have their weapons depots located underneath them, or inside them somewhere.
Yeah.
So and that might be the case with any of this, the ambulances, universities, any of it. So I don't know. look, as you said before, accidents happen in wartime. That could also be happening as well. But why do they necessarily jump to the conclusion that Israel is targeting all of these different places just for the sake of punishing the Palestinian people and the UN relief offices?
Well, it has to fit their narrative. If it's about power and inequality, the powerful want to retain power, and they have to regularly and continuously oppress those who are suffering oppression already,
Right.
lest they lose control over the oppressed. But
Kind
again,
of like, there's this thing about the UN relief
hold on,
office.
I want to just underscore this again. The fact is that hospitals here, when you click on the link, it takes you to a piece that's already 7 days old about that bombing of the hospital when they were still investigating it. It has now been documented that Israel had nothing to do with it, yet they're putting it in their statement. So these sociologists are 2,000 people are liars, right?
Well, I don't think they're not. The people that wrote it are liars, but I'm not going to call every signer a liar.
Okay, they're just stupid.
They're just going along with it blindly. Now, as far as this thing about the relief office, the UN relief offices, it reminds me of, when Israel got all that flack for bombing the Associated Press office in Operation Guardian of the Walls, right? Well, but Hamas had an office there. Who knows what else? I mean, I don't know why Israel has destroyed some of these places. I believe Israel has actually destroyed some of these places. I have no doubt. But, why? Why did they? Like, what is it about? There's probably a military reason for it. I give Israel the benefit of the doubt. They're not going to just destroy a place where there's a lot of civilians for no reason whatsoever. There's a reason for it.
Yeah. Israel does not deliberately target civilians. And sure, you could find right-wing extremists in the West Bank who do target civilians. And perhaps the Israeli government turns a blind eye to some of it, but the Israeli government does not go out of its way to target civilians.
When there was the pogrom on the West Bank last year, I was very vocally against that. Whenever I see the Jewish settlers mistreat Palestinians on the West Bank, I'm very vocally opposed to it. But the government itself is not intentionally doing that. Then you have this bit about the white phosphorus, the gas. Well, I mean, that supposedly has happened, but it's not illegal under international law. That's legal.
Yeah.
It's illegal, I guess, in highly populated areas, but the gas wasn't used out in a place where the international law precludes it.
Yeah, 100%. And that's the point. If Hamas inserts itself into all these civilian places, and Gaza is the second most densely populated in the world, which I think is mentioned somewhere in this statement as well, then by definition, it is going to be used in areas inhabited by civilians. There's no way around that. So again, it's very disingenuous. And, the cutting off water, food, electricity. I mean,
that's what happens when you have a siege.
Yeah.
And it's illegal to cut off water, food, electricity, medical supplies, etc. It's illegal to starve a population as a tactic of war. But it's not illegal to do that as a consequence of the war. And that is what has happened. Israel can't have Hamas, bringing in reinforcement weapons in barrels of rice and in other food parcels like that. It has no choice. If Hamas is going to continue doing that, what else can Israel do? Now, in the past few days, in fact, I think that whoever wrote this statement really ought to update it, because in the past few days, the border crossing has been opened and humanitarian trucks have been brought in. So it's at this point a lie that they're starving the Gazan population.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So again, this paragraph has at least one lie in it, and they have two lies probably, and major distortions to boot. Right. Now, this paragraph, the next one, is also really interesting, and I think we need to read it here. Israel's military campaign has also displaced nearly half of Gaza's population it has unconscionably demanded that 1.1 million residents relocate from northern Gaza to southern Gaza in 24 hours, even though Israel kept extending that and still hasn't launched a ground invasion, while simultaneously bombing caravans of those attempting to evacuate, which, again, the evidence for that's very sketchy, and continuing to bomb the southern part of Gaza. Let's talk about for a second here the displaced, the 1.1 million who were forced to evacuate from northern to southern Gaza. Why did Israel insist they were evacuated?
I'm sorry, I missed your question.
Why did Israel insist that the northern population of Gaza evacuate to southern Gaza?
Oh, because they were going to bomb it.
Right. So let me underscore another contradiction here. If Israel is deliberately targeting civilians, why would they tell the civilians to evacuate the area that they are bombing and they are going to invade?
Your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah, outright contradiction.
It wasn't a demand; it was a warning, right?
Yeah.
You're going to be killed if you stay here.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like Israel is trying to take steps to ensure that civilians don't unnecessarily get killed.
And 24 hours is a long time to wait, even if they haven't extended it. It's still a fairly long time, considering that Hamas could get a lot done in 24 hours to regroup and to bring in, reinforcements up at the north or whatever it is they're going to do.
This is war. If it were feasible, Israel could have gone in 24 hours, it could have gone in 5 hours afterwards, and it would have been fine.
Yeah, Israel can blow this place off the map in just a couple of hours. It doesn't need to wait a week and a half like this. And it's still not concluded. The only reason why this is not concluded is because Israel is concerned about civilians.
Yeah.
That's the only reason. If they didn't care about civilians, they would wipe and annihilate this whole little area off the map right now.
Yeah, exactly. Now, this next sentence is very interesting for a number of reasons. Calls for evacuation, in quotation marks, parallel the military offenses of 48 and 67. As a historian, I'm going to comment on this in a minute, when Palestinians were forced to leave their homes and never allowed to return. The majority of people in Gaza are long-term refugees and now again face genocide and ethnic cleansing. Leave the genocide aside for a second. Okay, now there's one thing here with the word evacuation. Okay, obviously they're referring to the northern Gazans being told to leave for southern Gazans. I don't think sociologists are smart enough to pull this off, and I don't think they actually read history. But if you read the minutes from the Wannsee conference, where the Nazi leaders, Heydrich and Eichmann, on behalf of Himmler and Hitler, got together the heads of all the branches of government because they needed them to sign off on the final solution, they don't use the word, extermination anywhere. They say basically we are switching from a policy of emigration to a policy of evacuation. The word evacuation was their code word for discussing the final solutions. Now, if I thought that the sociologists actually read history books and had any intelligence, I would suggest that that was a deliberate insertion to liken Israeli actions to those of the Nazis. But that would be giving sociologists too much credit. So I'm not about to credit them for that. But again, with the word in quotation marks, perhaps. More importantly, the likening to military offenses of 48 and 67, when Palestinians were forced to leave their homes and never allowed to return. Now, there's a major issue here. 1948, yes, obviously Israel ethnically cleansed some villages, as did the Arabs who invaded Israel and the Palestinian soldiers and terrorists who were involved. They also ethnically cleansed entire villages of Israel, of Jews, most notably East Jerusalem, which had a Jewish population before the 1948 war. But what needs to be made clear here is that they're saying this is the product of Israel's demand that all these northern Palestinians, northern Gazans evacuate. But in 1948, yeah, sure, Israel issued warnings at times, but it was the leaders of the Arab states and the leaders of the Palestinians who told the Palestinian population to evacuate. They said, you need to leave, and you're going to come back right after the war. For whatever reason, they said that. But the point is that the Arab leaders were deeply complicit in the evacuation of Palestinians from their homes in 1948. 1967, I can't speak to as well. I don't know the details as much. But this is a major point about 1948. Yeah, I'm not going to deny that Israel practiced ethnic cleansing in some parts.
What about all of the Arab countries that expelled Jews during this period of time?
Well, that was after the wars, but yeah,
well, of course it was. But where are they going to go if it wasn't for Israel? Like what that has to be part of this whole story as well.
It should be, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the woke lefties, like a political science professor in Carleton, I won't name, Carleton, Ottawa, her response to that is, well, they should get restitution from those Arab states and be allowed to return to their homes. How many Israelis are going to pack their bags and go back to Iraq? Yeah, gee, that sounds like a good idea. And a lot of them, I mean, they've intermarried at this point. So when I put this, when one of the Palestinian leaders said this once, someone commented on my Facebook page. So they want my head to go back to Morocco and my ass to go back to Tunisia. I mean, it's absurd. It's an utterly absurd claim. But with Syria and the other Arab states deliberately keeping them in refugee camps unto the third generation, they are doing this so they can showcase them as victims of Israeli criminality and use them as an asset in delegitimizing the Jewish state. If they gave them citizenship, like all other immigrants, they would have been integrated into their countries, and this would no longer be an issue. Right. So this is a deeply, deeply problematic sentence for a variety of reasons. And again, we have the word genocide here. I have seen zero evidence that Israel is conducting genocide today, yesterday, or at any point since the 1948 war started.
Well, you know, what happens in a genocide is that the population numbers go down. If this is a genocide, then how is it that the population numbers have exponentially increased? Yeah,
no, it makes no sense. And if they're, I can't tell with this if they're referring specifically to the Gaza operation or if they're talking specifically of what's going on in long-term Arab-Israeli conflict or short-term Gaza operation.
It's hard to tell what they mean here.
Well, they're not very good writers, but I've seen a lot of people in social media call what's going on in Gaza a genocide. And really, I mean, if 5,000 people have been killed and that's a genocide. What's the population of Gaza?
I don't know whether they're talking about the current operation being a genocide or if the last 15 years or the last 20 years have been genocide.
Well, Israel has not engaged in genocide at any point in its history.
Never, no.
And I will argue with anyone who wants to make that claim. Now, ethnic cleansing is a different matter, but what's very sloppy here is once they have the word genocide, why do you need to mention ethnic cleansing? Genocide supersedes ethnic cleansing.
Ethnic cleansing can include the expulsion of
people. Absolutely. But I mean, once you have genocide, that pretty much covers everything that would be like below it in the hierarchy of war casualties and war crimes. So again, very, very sloppy writing. Let's continue. Anything on this? Oh, yeah, again with the genocide. We are witnessing internationally supported genocide. Okay, what does that mean, internationally supported? Are they referring to Biden's speech? I mean, is that what? Because
well, I mean, they're upset that the world, much of the Western world, is supporting Israel.
Right.
The United States, Western Europe, you know, the blue and white colors are going up on the Brandenburg Gates in Germany. There's clearly in Western Europe and in the US and Canada strong support. Even Australia, which had the blue and white on their skyline, I guess in Melbourne, there's clearly support internationally for Israel and all this.
Yeah. But here they make clear when they say a continuation. They see genocide as part of the bigger picture, 75 years from 1948 to the present. Now, most genocides don't unfold over the case of 75 years. The closest thing I could think of is, well, you could read this book by, God, what's his name? I'm drawing a blank now. A great Israeli historian called The 30-Year Genocide. And it talks about the Ottoman genocide of Christian populations, most notably the Armenians. But this is not that. I mean, you see the clear moments where mass murder took place. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, and that is just simply not what's been happening here since 1948.
You know, and as far as this line goes, this latest siege comes as a continuation and escalation of the daily violence Palestinians face for decades from Israeli population.
Colonization.
They get in, they talk about the apartheid regime, occupation, all that. Look, what is being left out of this entire picture, at least if when you're talking about Gaza, West Bank we put aside, but when you're talking about Gaza, there is a blockade there. Now, why is there a blockade? Because Hamas has this very hostile mission that they have placed into their 1988 charter. Before Hamas came into power in 2007, through an election and through the PA president off the roof, Israel had an agreement with Gaza called the Agreement on Movement and Access.
Who did they throw off the roof?
The president of the Fatah president.
Wasn't that Arafat at the time? Or sorry, wasn't that Abbas?
No, it was the Fatah leader.
Okay, but that wasn't Abbas in 2005?
No, Abbas wasn't thrown off a roof.
Oh, no, I know that. But so he's PM, he's prime minister, I guess. Okay, so Fatah, they also have a president.
Fatah had its own there was a separate government in Gaza.
Okay, so the Fatah government of Gaza.
Right.
They really like throwing people off the roofs, I've noticed.
Yeah. Anyway, so
hold on, wait a sec. But if Israel has destroyed all their buildings, how can they throw people off the roof?
They've destroyed their own buildings. I guess they kept a building intact so that they had a place to throw the guy off the roof. I don't know. Yeah, anyway, so there was an agreement, the Agreement on Movement and Access, which went on for 2 years since disengagement until the point at which Hamas won that election. This agreement allowed Gaza to have a seaport and an airport. There used to be an airport, the Yasser Arafat Airport in Gaza. But Hamas made it very clear that they're not interested in keeping the terms of that agreement with Israel, which requires that they cease all hostilities with Israel. They refuse to do so. So, you know, they were the ones that nullified this, thus requiring Israel to blockade Gaza.
Wouldn't an airport be useful? But this way they wouldn't have to throw people off of buildings. They could do it off of airplanes and stuff.
You would think so, but they don't need an airport if they're just going to throw people off the building.
Yeah.
So, I don't know.
Yeah.
But you see what I'm saying, though? That
absolutely, of course.
Yeah.
So furthermore,
these statements like these have absolutely no knowledge of, display no knowledge of history, of what actually led, the context that led to all these things.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right.
Israel was bent over backwards to try to maintain a peaceful relationship with the Palestinians, at least in Gaza. I'm not going to address the other side just yet.
The West Bank's more complicated.
Yeah, more complicated.
Yeah, but no, Gaza's pretty straightforward. Furthermore, the dehumanizing language used by heads of state, military leaders, and journalists throughout the West. Who has been using dehumanizing language out of elected leaders? Can you name one? I can't think of a single leader in a Western country who has used dehumanizing language. I mean, except for calling Hamas evil. Is that wrong?
I don't know. I mean, you could argue that Trump did. You could, but he's not president anymore.
Yeah, and if you look at Trump's collection of statements of what he's said about other people, I think he said far worse things about, at least a dozen other ethnic groups than the Palestinians.
Yeah, he said worse things about his own political rivals in the United States. So,
Yeah. So, okay, we can't take that seriously. And yeah, there have been a few hate crimes, absolutely. But there's also been a rise in hate crimes against the Jews. There was that rabbi who was stabbed to death. We still don't know, or the president of the synagogue who was stabbed to death. We don't know the particulars of it. But I've heard of plenty of people being assaulted and bullied on college campuses. So it's not as if this harassment is only occurring to pro-Palestinian voices around the globe, if there is in fact such.
There is a big concern in the Jewish communities across the United States about their own safety. They're going on heightened alert everywhere.
Jewish students are freaking out on college campuses. I know this with certainty.
What's that?
Jewish students are freaking out on many
Yes,
college campuses.
and faculty.
Yeah, I know this with certainty.
Mhm.
Yeah. Now, coming towards the end here, I mean, this is really the kicker at the end. It is our duty to stand by the principles of critical inquiry and learning, to hold the university as a space for conversation that foregrounds historical truths and that contextualizes this past week's violence.
Hey, where's the critical inquiry then? Where's
There's
the
none.
learning?
This document shuts everything down, beginning with its open premise. The open premise alone stifles the conversation and says that this is the only thing, the only variable that's useful in explaining how societies work. And then everything else here is, to call it one-sided is an understatement. I mean, they've left out any part of the Israeli narrative. Whether some of the Israeli narrative is untrue, I mean, that's certainly open to debate, but that's the point. You have critical inquiry and debate to see why these two sides have arrived at different conclusions.
That's what critical inquiry means.
Yeah. Yeah, it's absurd because they're actually rejecting critical inquiry with this document and foregrounds historical truths. There's nothing historical in this whatsoever except a few passing references to 48 and 67 that are not only simplistic, they're also dead wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and of course, once they say 75 years of settler colonial occupation and European empire.
Right.
Okay. So that means, if we're talking about the past 75 years, so that means they're saying Israel is a European empire? Is that the implication?
That seems to be the implication.
All right, then. What Europeans are running Israel at this point? 60% of the population is Mizrahi. I don't see how they're run by Europeans.
Also, it's not an empire because an empire suggests that these people are representatives of European powers.
Yeah.
They never were. They were refugees from European powers.
Yeah. Yeah, who worked with the British in a very, very careful relationship that was premised on mistrust. Neither the British nor the Jews trusted each other for very good reasons. And Zev Jabotinsky understood this quite early on in the 1920s. So yada, 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 continuation of this genocidal war. We've seen this already. Now,
something about, as well as efforts to clamp down on student organizing and free speech. Well, that's been happening to Jewish organizations too.
Every damn BDS resolution, it was done with the purpose of intimidating Jewish students on campus. Now, the last portion here is extremely problematic. This stance follows in the tradition of the civil rights movement, anti-war and anti-apartheid protests of decades past, aligning ourselves with these freedom struggles. Okay, so they're taking the Arab-Israeli conflict and they're inserting this as the equivalent of African Americans rising up to protest centuries of slavery and Jim Crow.
If I was an African American leader, I would be completely insulted by this.
Yeah.
To have my struggle for the right to vote in the United States and to eliminate racial segregation compared to what Hamas is doing.
How many Passover Seders did African American leaders blow up? Can you think of a single one?
No.
Okay. Yeah. How many times did African Americans, occupy a school bus and then blow it up? Can you think of a single one?
I can't think of any.
Okay. Well, how many times have African Americans attacked 1,400 Jewish civilians and massacred them, or white American civilians, obviously, given the context?
I don't know of any instance in which that has happened.
Yeah, so obviously the analogy is patently absurd, but it's also very pernicious because by inserting the Palestinian cause into what is considered to be causes that are part of the universal quest for justice and human rights, it's making an assumption that that's what the Palestinian struggle for freedom is a part of and is really the center of it today. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which, again, is absurd. And of course, they have to finish off with the last settler colonialism, imperialism, and genocide. God forbid they even try to define any of these terms. Okay,
yeah,
well,
they're just words that are thrown in that sound scary, but don't mean anything.
Right. So in 45 minutes, and really we could have done it in 4 minutes, we've demonstrated that this statement is complete bullshit, and it's being written by people who, probably really shouldn't have PhDs. I mean, if their academic work is reflective of what they put into words here, then there is a real problem in that discipline.
But the elephant in the room statement and the response to October 7th that followed it, at least that was written by people that study this to some degree.
Yeah.
Right. At least there's that. So there's some basis of knowledge and expertise involved. But it's obvious that none of these people here know anything about this, about what's going on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, again, like professor of law and sociology, professor of civil rights, University of Pennsylvania. Oh, look, I got Pennsylvania again. I mean, if this person is a professor of civil rights, it's safe to say that any knowledge they have of the Middle East, I mean, I don't want to make assumptions about this person particularly, but in general, they're using whatever models they've created for understanding the United States, and they assume they could just drop that model in another time and place with a touch of anti-Semitism thrown in, and use that to explain what they're talking about. Michael Boroway is one of the few people I've actually heard of on this list, who taught at Berkeley, and he's written stuff on the former Soviet Union, which is the only reason I know his name. He is a hardcore, my understanding is he's a Marxist, but I've never had the pleasure of meeting him or working with him. There's 46 signatures from Berkeley. Let's see, University of Pennsylvania, just out of curiosity, I want to see who are the, oh, there's only 6 from Pennsylvania. What about Michigan? 30 from University of Michigan or other Michigan schools. I wonder where the majority are coming. I guess it's a really diverse, geographically speaking, audience or a list of signatories here. So Lacey Kostishak, no affiliation. For a while they were letting all sorts of people sign it. I noticed that Colin Kaepernick signed it. I noticed that Donald Trump signed it. Joseph Mengele signed it twice. Interestingly enough, but they seem to have purged those people. Especially, I guess Mengele is dead, so they assumed it couldn't really.
There were a few other, like at one point there was someone that signed their name as anti-Semite professor Harvard.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what this basically is. This is a deeply, calling it even an anti-Semitic document. I mean, it is, right? But
I wouldn't say that all these people are anti-Semites.
I have no idea. I don't know.
But it is an anti-Semitic document.
Absolutely, yeah. And they don't use the word. They don't use the word Jew.
My colleague who signed it is not an anti-Semite. All right, but this is a statement that to me screams anti-Semitism.
They don't use the word Jew or Zionist once either, which is actually remarkable. But those are the implications, and they don't have traditional anti-Semitic tropes in it either, unlike the elephant in the room.
That's true.
Yeah, but ultimately it is painting a one-sided picture here that is premised not only on misinformation but outright lies. And of course, the wider thing, they're holding Israel to a double standard here. I mean, they're making it sound like this is the worst conflict going on in the world, which is utterly absurd. Did they issue a statement about Ukraine? They probably did as a discipline, as many disciplines did. But I mean, I could think of dozens, at least a dozen other conflicts in the world that merit more attention from academics who are concerned with human rights than this particular conflict does. And at the very least, for Christ's sakes, have an opening paragraph about condemning Hamas's violence. But they can't even do that. They are unwilling to even do that. So 1,900 signatories. I'll refresh the screen. Let's see if they've gotten any more since we started our broadcast. 1921. I think that's one more. Okay, but they're still working at it. They probably do them in batch. I'm going to turn off screen share.
I mean, how do you get almost 2,000 signatures in just a few days? I didn't get, if we tried it as the Jewish Studies Zionist Network, granted, we are only interested in signatures for us from people within the narrow field of Jewish studies. But I would be willing to bet that if we put something out, a statement out, inviting all academics in any field to sign, or at least all academics within history or within political science, we would not get close to 2,000 signatures.
You're right, because siding with Israel puts you on the side of genocide and oppression. and very few people are willing to put themselves out there. Again, it's striking, and many people, especially David Hirsch, have pointed this out, that it's really remarkable that tenured professors who support Israel are afraid to sign any documents because it'll ruin their career, yet untenured and graduate students are not afraid at all to sign any pro-Palestinian statements because they know it won't endanger them. And this claim that they're getting harassed is utterly absurd. It's just not happening, to the extent, at least, that they claim it is. The point, at the very least, is that these untenured professors and these graduate students feel safe in signing these documents, whether in fact they are safe or not. Whereas Zionists do not feel safe coming out as Zionists. And as we discussed in our last podcast about Michigan, this is what the situation is heading towards on so many campuses. You can be a closeted Jew and go about your life quietly. In an age of identity politics, you're the one person who won't be allowed to express your identity, or you can be openly Jewish. And I want to stress the word Jewish here, not just Zionist, because once you're Jewish, you are under suspicion, and you will get harassed and traumatized at the very least by being exposed to outright hostility and threats towards the state that contains 50% of world Jewry and their so-called emissaries abroad. So this is where we're at. I don't think there's much more to say about this, except, I just want to underscore again the sloppy language that this document is written in. And, if a student of mine or even a graduate student turned in something like this, I would send it back to them. I'm saying this is nonsensical from a scholarly perspective. You need to read this carefully and show how one sentence does not logically flow from the previous one, except insofar is that you're defining all of history and sociology and society based on the premise of power and powerlessness. That is your defining framework for understanding the entire world around you. As a sociologist and as a human being.
I don't have a problem if an individual sociologist wants to define himself or herself that way. Like, this is how I practice sociology with that framework. As a political scientist, I have my own frameworks, but I would never impose that framework on my entire discipline, which is what is happening here.
Yeah.
Ultimately, they're right, actually. Like, this is what sociology, at least from an outside perspective, seems to have become. But I still would insist, even if you have maybe 99% of them that operate with this premise as the foundation of their field, that's not the foundation of the field. That's their methodology, their lens that they use, but it's not the very definition of what sociology is. Sociology is just the study of society.
That's what it's supposed to be, at least. Yeah, but again, they seem to be working on this, Marxist influenced framework, and their discipline, and I don't want to draw political science into this, but sociology, at the very least, they start with their ideological framework, and then they proceed forward from that. Now, historians, and I'm not saying historians don't have their, ideological frameworks, hovering in the background, but a good historian studies the place that they want to look at. They're trying to explain why things happen. Sure, if they're labor historians, they're going to focus on things like class conflict, but they're not going to, reach some sort of sweeping conclusion, right? At the end, they will reach a conclusion and they will premise it perhaps in an ideological framework, but they're not going to start saying it applies to all times and places, and that therefore we should use this to study every other society in every time and place. But, that's what leftist activists do. And here we see that they have the backing from an academic discipline to approach the world in this way.
I'm a social scientist. I'm a conservative social scientist, though. As a social scientist, I want to solve social problems. I want to solve political problems. I want to solve social problems. I want to solve economic problems. Problems need to be solved. That's why I got into this, right? If we
have you actually solved any problems?
No. Okay. No, but if we operate solely on single dimensional thinking about society, we're not going to solve anything. Like, if this is where they begin as the basic premise of their field, like this is the only way to look at it, you're not going to solve anything.
Historians aren't trying to solve anything.
I know that.
We are not in the business of trying to prevent genocide. We don't teach the Holocaust so that genocide won't happen again.
But we are.
The Holocaust to explain why it happened. That's the point. We're looking for causality and how you get from point A to point B. If others want to take the research that we do and use it to solve problems, that's their tasks, but it is not the task of a historian. Historians also shouldn't predict the future under any circumstances. Nobody should predict the future, but historians are really not in the business of doing that. And, you know, the number of historians...
Knowledge is supposed to be used for some kind of action.
Absolutely, but it should not be used in the production of that knowledge in the first place. The action, the activist agenda.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course. Yeah. Of course.
Yeah. But that's not the way academia is heading today. I mean, many disciplines say that activism is at the core of their discipline, and they're starting from that. And they're starting from a very narrowly Americano-centric framework of what such power and powerlessness and whatever else, you know, premised in critical race theory and whatnot, in order to solve such problems, and then they use it for other parts of the world. Or they take they take this framework and they try to explain feudalism in medieval Europe, which is, of course, completely absurd. But we are nearing the hour mark, and I'd like for once to have an episode that stays under 60 minutes. So I suggest we end things off now, unless Adam has any final words.
No, I don't.
Yeah, we're going to have to work on thinking of a catchy title for this one. But given that this statement is circulating, we are going to try to put this up right away. And if you haven't watched our previous episode, we have a journalist on it from Michigan who gives us a hands-on account of what's happening at the University of Michigan. And as much as Jewish studies faculty are living in a fantasy world denying it, we know that there is a problem. There is an anti-Semitic problem at the University of Michigan, and Jewish studies is turning a blind eye to it, and Jewish students are paying the price for it. So this is Jarrod, and this is Adam, signing off.
Okay, goodbye.
Goodbye.